Anthony Albanese, thank you for your time. The main purpose of your visit across the Tasman, your third overseas trip, I believe, since you replaced Bill Shorten as Labor leader, was your attendance at the Australia-New Zealand Leadership Forum, speaking about the state of trans-Tasman ties. Earlier today, you were rather glowing in your praise of the strength of the trans-Tasman relationship. Why is that?
Oh, because it's so important. We're family. And the relationship between Australia and New Zealand is an economic one. It is a social one. We have very similar cultures. But it's also, when it all comes down to it, a relationship between people. More and more we see with the world becoming a smaller place. Coming across here last night from Sydney is a quicker journey, of course, than going from Sydney to Perth. So it's not surprising that our two societies are so enmeshed. And that's why we have a common interest. That's why people-to-people relations are important. The forum today has been going for a number of years. I've attended meetings in Australia and here. And what we see is that the business links are there, as well as the social links. What these forums do is enable those personal relationships to be built up.
What was your main message to those gathered?
My main message was we need to work on our common interest. We know, for example, that we live in a period of time whereby we have the United States and China being competitive. That is raising issues about trade and some economic uncertainty. The global economy, of course, we're all interconnected, and that's why the relationship between two nations who have such a common interest in making sure that there's a rules-based trade regime, in making sure that we work in the Pacific, in particular, in this region.
Do you think there's enough coordination between Australia and New Zealand? Australia has the step up, New Zealand has the reset. Are they working hand in hand as Labor would like?
Look, I think they are, but we can always do better. So in the meetings that we've had here at the forum, but also meetings with the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, this morning, and the Foreign Minister, Winston Peters, that's about having discussions about how we can improve the relationship between us, have more commonality about the way that we conduct our affairs, not just between ourselves, but in the region as well. We have responsibility to show leadership in the region.
Was there an acknowledgement by either the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister about where both countries could go better, about greater alignment in the Pacific?
Look, the Foreign Minister in particular, we went through a range of discussions. We talked about forums that have recently occurred in the Pacific. Obviously, there's an interest in the Pacific about climate change, and there was some difficulties at the Tuvalu forum.
Pointing to the presence of the Australian Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, at that forum?
Well, there were some issues, but you know, there's a common interest in Australia seeing a successful relationship between us and New Zealand, but also Australia and our Pacific Island neighbours.
You said earlier today that the only tensions that exist between Australia and New Zealand are on the rugby field, but isn't it the case that there are tensions off the field as well, particularly with the issue of deportation?
Well, certainly that was raised, and I understand the Foreign Minister will say that it was raised, and he certainly did with us today. And
what language did he use around his concerns?
And that's been an issue. Well, he put New Zealand's position, and I'd expect nothing less. And we put, there's a common position in Australia about these issues, but certainly there is an understanding of why New Zealand puts the position that it does.
But an understanding's meaningless, isn't it, if Labor has the same position as the coalition in Australia and is not willing to make a policy change. This is an issue that New Zealand's Prime Minister has labelled as corrosive to trans-Tasman relations. So if you were Prime Minister, you would essentially be overseeing a policy that New Zealand, a country that you describe as family, sees as a corrosive issue. Well,
Labor, of course, during the last term of Parliament opposed legislation which went to the character test. We did that. I think New Zealand, certainly Winston Peters, acknowledged that this morning, that we had a different position on that. And we, I think, did differentiate ourselves during that last term.
But not
from
to the extent the
position.
New Zealand government would like to see.
No, that's correct. And it's important to have these honest discussions where there are differences.
Did the New Zealand Prime Minister also raise this issue?
Well, the New Zealand Prime Minister meeting was a private meeting, and as
so was the meeting with the Foreign Minister?
No, the Foreign Minister indicated that he was going to make public his position that it had been raised, and therefore I'm acknowledging that as well.
So if the New Zealand Prime Minister makes her position public in regards to what was said in the meeting, you did the same?
Well, the basis of the meeting with the New Zealand Prime Minister, which went for over an hour, it was very constructive. It was great to really get to know better the Prime Minister. I've met Jacinda before in Wellington, in Parliament House, but that was prior to her elevation to the Labor leadership and then her success in becoming Prime Minister. I think Prime Minister Ardern is certainly a role model in terms of the leadership that she has shown here in New Zealand. In particular, I think the whole world looked towards New Zealand in the way that you responded to the attack that occurred in Christchurch, where that atrocity was, of course, committed by someone who came from Australia. And so we were very cognizant of that fact and admired the way that not just the Prime Minister responded, of course, but the Muslim community and indeed the entire New Zealand community responded by sending out a message of unity and solidarity with the victims of that attack.
Do you believe New Zealanders living in Australia get a fair go because those who move across the Tasman don't necessarily have the same rights and benefits as Australian residents, citizens I should say, or permanent residents?
Look, I'd like to see, frankly, the capacity of New Zealanders to move more quickly through Australian citizenship improved. I think that New Zealanders play a critical role in Australia. There are, in my electorate, more people who were born in New Zealand than from any other country, of course, apart from Australia. And what we can't have is a circumstance whereby Russell Crowe, who I will spend time with tonight when I return at the football, and people, the Finn brothers and others that we like to claim as Australians. We can't do that and not embrace, I think, other contributions by New Zealanders. And it's been made more difficult, I think, in recent times. So I would want to see some of those processes streamlined. That's something that I would want to work with the community in Australia on.
Do you think there'll be support, widespread support within the community to do that? Why would Australians want more Kiwis living in their country?
Well, they're there. The point is whether
But it would encourage more to make the move, wouldn't it?
The point is whether they have the capacity to become permanent residents and then citizens in a faster way. And the other issue is, of course, there are more Australians moving to New Zealand than the other way around at the moment. New Zealand is benefiting from a range of Australians who are moving here. Why
do you think they're making the move?
Well, I have people in my community of Marrickville, which is in the inner west of Sydney. One of the families who my son went to school with have recently moved here, and that's about housing affordability and lifestyle. They regard New Zealand as a very attractive place to live and to bring up their family. and it certainly is a very attractive place. I've always enjoyed all of my visits to New Zealand, whether they be short visits like this on a professional basis, or whether they be times I've travelled here on holiday.
One final issue. What's Labor's position on New Zealand's long-standing offer to take in, to resettle 150 refugees per year from Australia's offshore processing centre?
Well, we think that should be taken up. This was an arrangement, of course, that was offered by Prime Minister Key way back when Labor was in government with Prime Minister Gillard, but was not able to be put in place. Had that occurred, because it was an annual offer, there would be, by now, some 900 people could have been settled here in New Zealand. That's a greater number than those people who will remain on Nauru and Manus after the US settlement arrangement is completed. Now, it seems to me that there is a difficulty in saying that it's okay to settle people in the United States, but not okay for people to settle here in New Zealand. And that's an offer that's been reiterated, so it's a bipartisan offer from both sides of New Zealand's politics. And
was it reiterated at all today?
I think it wasn't discussed with Foreign Minister Peters, and I refer to previous comments about the meeting with and discussions with Prime Minister Ardern. But certainly, common sense tells you that the government now, which has been in government for more than 6 years, longer than the periods of the Rudd and the Gillard governments, they're in their third term, and they're still talking about what happened when Labor was in office, which is now more than 6 years ago. It's about time that this government stopped acting like an opposition in exile on the government benches and took responsibility for what it needs to do to resolve these issues.
Labor leader Anthony Albanese, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.